Snow came down mixed with rain over London that night, the kind of cold that did not fall so much as crawl into the bones and stay there. Behind the Kensington Grand Hotel, in the narrow service alley where the kitchen steam rolled out into the freezing air, a girl stood pressed against the brick wall, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. Her name was Lucy Shaw. She was 19 years old, and she had not eaten in 3 days. Through the open kitchen door, she could see the warmth she was not allowed to enter. Copper pots gleamed. A boy no older than 12 carried a silver tray past her, and on it sat the ruins of someone's dinner, a folded napkin, a half-empty wine glass, and beside it, untouched, half a loaf of bread. Lucy did not look at the silver. She did not look at the boy's warm coat, or the fire glowing beyond the doorway, or the easy way he walked as though his stomach had never once betrayed him. She looked only at the bread. She had learned, in the year since she left the only home she had ever known, that hunger did not announce itself gently. It sat in her chest like a stone. It made her hands shake, even when she willed them still. It made proud things feel small. She stepped forward and caught the boy's sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "Don't throw it away." The boy startled, and before he could answer, a heavier hand closed around Lucy's arm. A senior waiter, broad through the shoulders, his face already twisted in disgust at the sight of her ragged shawl and rain-soaked hair. "Out," he said. "This isn't a poorhouse." He dragged her forward, not out through the alley, but through the dining room itself, perhaps meaning to make an example of her, perhaps simply too irritated to think of a gentler path. Chandeliers blazed overhead. Silk and velvet and diamonds turned to look at the ragged girl being hauled past white tablecloths, and somewhere among the murmurs, Lucy heard a woman say the word vermin, as though it were the most natural word in the world. Shame should have kept her silent. Hunger did not allow it. As the waiter pulled her past the largest table in the room, she saw a plate set with roasted meat, most of it gone, and beside it, forgotten, half a loaf of bread. She looked up and found herself staring into the face of the man seated there. Dark hair silvering at the temples, a jaw set with the kind of stillness that came from a lifetime of being obeyed, eyes the grey of a winter sky. She did not know his name. She did not know that half of London bowed when he entered a room, that his signature moved fortunes, that the hotel itself stood on land his family had held for 200 years, or that the 51 years etched faintly into the lines around his eyes had been spent, for the last 19 of them, mourning a daughter he believed he had buried. She knew only that he was not yet finished eating, and that the bread beside his plate would soon be scraped into a bin behind the kitchen, with the rest of the waste from a room that had more of everything than it could ever want. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice cracking on the title she did not know was accurate. "Might I have the bread you intend to leave?" The room went silent. It was the particular silence of well-bred people who have never before been asked, plainly and without apology, to notice what they throw away. The Duke of Ashcroft set down his glass. "Release her," he said. The waiter's grip did not loosen. "Your Grace, she's a vagrant. She's disturbing." I said, "Release her." Something in his voice made the man's hand fall away at once. Lucy swayed, free but unsteady, aware of every eye in the room fixed upon her rags, her cracked lips, the dirt under her nails. She had imagined, 100 times over the past year, what it would feel like to be looked at with contempt. She had not imagined it would still hurt this much, every single time. "She is hungry," the Duke said, to the room as much as to the waiter. "That is not a crime." He rose. He pulled out the chair across from his own, not gestured toward the door, not toward the servants' passage, but the empty chair at his own table, and said, quite simply, "Sit." A woman 2 tables away, dressed in emerald silk with diamonds at her throat, rose halfway from her seat. "Ambrose, surely you do not intend to have that creature dine among us." Lucy felt the word creature land somewhere beneath her ribs and stay there. The Duke, Ambrose, the woman had called him, though Lucy would not learn his full name and title for hours yet, turned to face her without hurry. "Lady Cordelia, he said. "If the sight of hunger offends you more than the fact of it, the door is behind you." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Lady Cordelia sat back down with the stiff fury of a woman unused to losing an argument in public, and the dining room, chandeliers blazing, silverware gleaming, returned to a silence that now held something other than disgust. Lucy sat. Her legs would not have carried her much further regardless of pride. The Duke did not hand her the crust from his own plate, as charity so often imagined itself. He lifted 2 fingers, and within a minute, a fresh place had been set before her. Warm bread, hot soup, a napkin folded with more care than she had received from another human being in over a year. "Eat slowly," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Your body has forgotten how." She obeyed, because her hands were shaking too badly to do otherwise, and because something in the plainness of his instruction undid a knot in her chest that pride alone had kept tied. It was as she reached for the bread, her sleeve falling back from her wrist, that the locket slipped free of her collar and swung against the white tablecloth. Small, tarnished silver, engraved with a crest of 2 crossed swords beneath a crown. Its hinge had been bent long ago, the catch loose enough that it hung slightly open, and inside, 2 small oval frames sat empty, whatever portraits they once held lost to time or damage. Ambrose Sterling, Duke of Ashcroft, went very still. He had commissioned that very locket himself, the winter before his daughter was born, for his wife Evelyn. One oval frame meant to hold his own portrait, the other left empty and waiting for the child not yet born. He had not seen it in 19 years, not since the night it vanished from the nursery, along with everything else he believed he had lost. "Where?" he said slowly. "Did you get that?" Lucy's hand rose instinctively to cover it. Old habit from a childhood of being told not to draw attention to the one pretty thing she owned. "The matron gave it to me, sir, when I left St. Cecilia's foundling home. She said it was found with me, as an infant." 2 questions settled into the room like smoke that would not clear. Why was a starving girl from a foundling home wearing the private crest of the House of Ashcroft? And why, when Ambrose looked at her more closely, at the line of her jaw, the particular grey-green of her eyes, did he feel, for the first time in 19 years, that he was looking at his dead wife's face? Lucy did not wait to answer either question. She finished the bread because her body demanded it, thanked him with the stiff formality of someone who has decided not to feel grateful for what shame has cost her, and left the hotel alone, back into the sleet, because she did not want to owe a stranger anything more than a meal. She made it 3 streets before her legs gave out, and the cold took her down into the snow. When she woke, she was in a carriage bearing a crest she now recognized, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of cedar and leather, and the Duke of Ashcroft was watching her with an expression she could not name. Not pity, not curiosity, but something closer to fear, as though he had just been handed back something he had buried 19 years before, and was afraid to believe it was real. Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome back to our fireside of stories. If tales of stolen heiresses, proud dukes, and slow-burning Victorian love are the kind of thing that keeps you up long past when you meant to sleep, then you are exactly where you belong tonight. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so more stories like Lucy's find their way to you. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. We read every single one, and it means more to us than you know. Now settle in, dim the lights if you can, because what began with a girl begging for bread is about to become a story of a stolen child, a guilty brother, and a love that had to be earned before it could be spoken aloud. Ashcroft Abbey rose out of the winter mist like something out of a fairy tale that had forgotten how to be gentle. Grey stone towers, ivy stripped bare by frost, windows that seemed to watch the approaching carriage rather than simply reflect it. Lucy pressed her palm to the cold glass and stared, and for the first time in a year, fear crowded out hunger as the loudest voice in her chest. She had spent the carriage ride rehearsing gratitude and refusal in equal measure, unsure which the Duke would expect of her. What she had not rehearsed was the sight of a woman waiting at the top of the stone steps, tall and silver-haired, arms crossed with the particular patience of someone who has raised difficult men her entire life. "So," the woman said, before Ambrose had even helped Lucy down from the carriage, "you have refused every dinner invitation in London for 19 years, Ambrose, and you return from one with a girl half drowned, and wearing our mother's crest. I confess myself impressed. It is quite a recovery." "Beatrice," Ambrose said, in the tone of a man long accustomed to his sister's tongue. Lady Beatrice Sterling looked Lucy over. The ruined shawl, the bruised knees where she had fallen in the street, the locket now tucked safely inside her collar, and something in her assessing gaze softened, though her voice did not. "Well, come inside before you catch your death twice in one evening. I have not the patience to nurse two crises at once." Inside, Ashcroft Abbey was warmer than any building Lucy had stood in since she was a child, and far larger than her mind knew how to hold. Portraits watched her pass down corridors hung with tapestries older than the nation's memory. A fire had been lit in a guest chamber in the West Wing, not the grandest room in the house, she would learn later, but comfortable, private, and safely far from a locked door at the end of the east corridor that no servant would meet her eye about. She was bathed. She was fed properly for the first time in longer than she could bear to count. She was given a plain grey dress that fit poorly but did not smell of the street, and when she finally lay down in a bed soft enough to swallow her whole, she found she could not sleep at all. The silence pressed on her ears in a way the noise of the alley never had. She lay rigid atop the blankets, afraid to disturb their perfect folding, afraid that if she closed her eyes she would wake and find the whole evening had been a fever dream, conjured by an empty stomach. It was past midnight when she gave up, and wandered the unfamiliar halls in search of a fire and a book, and found both in the library, where a young man sat with his boots up on a low table, and a ledger open across his knee, dark hair disordered, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the hour. He looked up. His eyes were sharp and assessing, the eyes of someone who had learned, long before tonight, to distrust convenient stories. "Miss Shaw," he said, "or should I say, Lady Lucinda, I did not give you leave to call me that. I have not decided yet what to call you." He closed the ledger with a deliberate, unhurried motion. "Sebastian Goodwin, 27 years of age, His Grace's private secretary, and, at present, the man tasked with determining whether you are his daughter, a very convincing fraud, or something in between." Lucy's spine straightened despite her exhaustion. "Do gentlemen always interrogate starving women before permitting them their soup, Mr. Goodwin? Only when they arrive wearing a dead duchess's crest, and no memory of how they came to own it." The words should have angered her further. Instead, something in his bluntness felt almost like relief after a night of careful kindness she did not yet trust. At least suspicion was honest. "I did not choose to own it," she said. "I did not choose any of this. I asked a man for bread because I had not eaten in 3 days, and I have been handed a house, a title, and your contempt in the space of one night. Forgive me if I have not yet decided how to be grateful for all three." Something shifted behind Sebastian's guarded expression. Not quite an apology, but close enough to it that Lucy noted the difference. "I did not say I held you in contempt," he said. "I said I do not yet trust convenient stories. There is a difference, Miss Shaw, though I grant you, it may not always feel like one." She took the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation, some old defiant habit surfacing from a childhood of charity home matrons who had never once let her sit without permission. "Then investigate," she said. "I have nothing to hide, Mr. Goodwin, because I have nothing at all. That is rather the point." He studied her a long moment, the fire cracking softly between them, and did not answer, because, though neither of them said it aloud that night, they had both begun, in that small, unguarded exchange, to suspect the other might be worth knowing. The following morning, Ambrose found himself standing outside a door at the end of the east corridor that had not been opened in 19 years. His hand rested on the brass handle. He did not turn it. Inside that room, a cradle still stood beneath a window facing the rose garden, exactly as it had been left the night his daughter died, or the night he was beginning to fear that she had not died at all. He thought of Evelyn, his wife, dead now 17 years, and the way she had wept and raged and insisted, against every physician's certainty, that their child still lived somewhere beyond the grave he had ordered sealed too quickly. He had believed grief had broken her mind. He had signed the papers, accepted the doctor's word, and buried his wife's suspicions along with the small closed coffin he had never once opened to look inside. He let his hand fall from the door without turning it. He was not yet ready to know what he might find on the other side, and he told himself, as he had told himself for 19 years, that hope was a luxury a grieving man could not afford twice. Downstairs, Lucy stood at the tall window of the guest chamber and watched frost creep across the glass, and thought of a locked door she had not yet learned existed, and of a father she did not yet know was searching, in his own frightened way, for the courage to claim her. Winter settled over Ashcroft Abbey with the particular stubbornness of a season that intended to stay, and within it, Lucy began to learn the shape of a life she had never dared imagine for herself. Lady Beatrice took charge of her manors with the brisk efficiency of a woman who believed feelings were best managed through occupation. There were forks to master, 4 of them laid out at each place setting like a small silver army, and Lucy's first attempt at using them correctly ended in Sebastian Goodwin watching from across the table, with poorly concealed amusement. "You are enjoying my humiliation, Mr. Goodwin. I am enjoying your accuracy of aim," he said. "You have selected the fish fork for your beef 3 times running, and each time with greater conviction. When one has eaten with one's fingers for the better part of a year," Lucy said, lifting her chin, "the existence of 4 forks seems less a courtesy than a personal insult." Beatrice, without looking up from her tea, murmured, "She is not wrong, Sebastian." Lucy caught the corner of his mouth twitching before he schooled it back into indifference, and something in her chest, some old caution, worn thin by kindness she had not expected, loosened by another small degree. He was not, she was learning, a cruel man. He was a careful one, and there was a difference she had not understood until she watched him work. Each afternoon, he closeted himself with ledgers and letters, tracing threads she did not yet understand, and each evening he emerged a little more troubled than the day before. It was Ambrose who finally sent him to St. Cecilia's foundling home, 3 days after Lucy's arrival, with instructions to learn everything the matron could tell him, and nothing of why he asked. The home had not changed since Lucy had walked out of its doors at 18. The same grey stone, the same rows of iron beds, the same matron with ink-stained fingers, and a face that had long ago learned to guard its softness behind duty. Sebastian found her in the small office, where records of the abandoned and unwanted were kept in locked cabinets, as though the paper itself might otherwise wander off unclaimed. "Lucy Shaw," the matron said, once he had explained his purpose without explaining his purpose. "A good girl. Quiet. Too proud to ask for help even when she needed it most, which I confess worried me more than if she had begged. She was found with certain effects," Sebastian said. "A locket, a ribbon, a note, water damaged beyond reading. Do your records show where they came from?" The matron rose, unlocked a drawer, and produced a ledger so old its leather binding had cracked at the spine. She turned pages with the particular tenderness of a woman who had spent her whole life keeping records nobody else thought to keep. "Here," she said, "the night she was brought to us. A woman delivered her, gave her name as Cecilia Holloway, though I never saw her again after that single night, nor learned why she never returned. The infant was 6 months of age by the physician's estimate. These were the effects left with her." She tapped the entry with one ink-stained finger. "A locket bearing a crest I did not recognize. A ribbon of fine embroidery, far too costly for an abandoned child, and a sealed note, ruined by rain before it ever reached me." Sebastian felt his pulse quicken, in a way he did not allow to show on his face. "You kept the locket in storage. She did not wear it as a child." "Heavens, no. An object of that value, on a foundling child, in a home with 40 other hungry mouths. It would have vanished within the week, and likely so would she, for whoever might have stolen it from her. I kept it locked until the day she left us, as I do with all such effects, and gave it into her hand only when she was grown enough to guard it herself. It was, Sebastian thought as he rode back toward the abbey in the fading afternoon light, precisely the detail that made the entire improbable story credible, rather than convenient. An expensive object surviving 19 years in the hands of an infant would have strained belief. An expensive object locked away by a careful matron and returned only at maturity did not. He found Ambrose in the study that evening and laid out what he had learned with the flat precision of a man unwilling to offer hope before it had been earned. "The dates align," he said. "The child was delivered to St. Cecilia's the same night the physician certified your daughter's death. The woman who brought her gave the name Cecilia Holloway." Ambrose's hand, resting on the desk, went white at the knuckle. "That was my daughter's nurse. I am aware, Your Grace. She disappeared the same night. I searched for her for a month before Archibald convinced me the grief had driven her to some private ruin, and that further searching would only distress Evelyn further." Ambrose's voice, usually so measured, cracked on his late wife's name. "I let it go, Sebastian. I let it go because my brother told me it was kinder." Sebastian said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing kind to say to a man realizing, 19 years too late, that the wrong voice had been trusted at the wrong moment. "There is more," he said instead. "I found, among the estate's old correspondence, a bundle of letters your late wife wrote in the months after the child's death. I have not read them fully. I did not believe it was my place. But the first lines of the topmost letter, Your Grace, concerned a coffin she said had been sealed before she was permitted to see the body properly." Ambrose did not reach for the letters that night. He sat with his hand pressed over his eyes for a long while, and Sebastian, who had learned discretion in a cavalry unit where men's grief was not to be witnessed lightly, let himself quietly out of the room. It was 2 nights later, during a storm that rattled the tall windows of the abbey like something demanding entry, that Lucy could not sleep again, and found her way once more to the library, where Sebastian sat with the bundle of Evelyn's letters spread before him, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You are always awake when I cannot sleep, Mr. Goodwin. I begin to suspect you never sleep at all." "I sleep less than I ought," he admitted. "It is an old habit from the cavalry. A man learns to distrust silence when silence has previously preceded an ambush." Lucy sat, drawn as much by curiosity as by the strange, careful warmth that had begun to grow between them despite themselves. "What happened to you there?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. "A man I trusted sold information to men who wished my company harm. Several did not survive it. I have found, since, that trust is a currency I spend very carefully, and rarely twice on the same coin. And yet you sit here each night, reading a dead woman's letters on my behalf, though you have no cause yet to trust that I am who the locket suggests I am." "I do it on His Grace's behalf," Sebastian said. "Whether I do it on yours as well is a question I have not finished answering." She reached across the low table and turned one letter toward the light, careful of its brittle age, and read a line in a hand she did not recognize but felt. Somehow, she should have. "I know the silence of sleep, Ambrose. The silence they gave me was not death. A mother knows the difference, even when no one else will believe her." Lucy set the letter down with hands that were not entirely steady. "She believed I was alive." "She believed someone was alive," Sebastian corrected gently, though there was little conviction left in his caution. "We have not yet proven it was you, but you believe it now. I can see it in your face, Mr. Goodwin. Whatever your ledgers demand you say aloud." He did not deny it, which she took, in the firelight, as its own kind of answer. Their hands, she realized only afterward, had both come to rest on the same worn page, close enough that the warmth of his fingers reached hers, without either of them quite closing the last inch of distance. Neither moved. The fire cracked. Somewhere above them the storm continued its assault on the old stone walls, and for one suspended moment, Neither Lucy nor Sebastian seemed inclined to remember that propriety existed at all. It was the clock in the hall striking 2 that finally broke the spell, and Sebastian withdrew his hand first, clearing his throat with the particular discomfort of a man reminding himself of his own rules. "You should sleep, Miss Shaw. So should you, Mr. Goodwin." Neither of them moved to leave for a long moment, and when Lucy finally climbed the stairs to her chamber, she found she was smiling for the first time since she had entered this house, and could not have said, had anyone asked her, whether it was the letters or the man who had read them to her that had put it there. The proof, when it came, did not arrive all at once, as Lucy had half hoped it would, in her most exhausted, most homesick moments. It arrived in fragments, each one small enough to doubt on its own, and only devastating when laid side by side with the others. Sebastian found the undertaker's account books in a dusty archive room, above a shop that had buried 3 generations of London's wealthy dead. The entry, when he found it, was almost too plain to be sinister. A payment recorded for a sealed infant coffin, a private surcharge noted beside it in Archibald Sterling's own hand, and no corresponding receipt anywhere in the ledger for the delivery of a body. He rode back to the Abbey, with the book wrapped in oilcloth against the rain, and found Ambrose in the study, poring over estate accounts with the distracted energy of a man trying very hard not to think about anything at all. There was no body, Sebastian said, without preamble, because he had learned by now that gentleness only prolonged the wound. The coffin was paid for, sealed by instruction, never opened for viewing, and Archibald paid the undertaker a private surcharge the ledger does not explain. Ambrose closed his eyes. "Say it plainly, Sebastian. I find I have no more patience left for careful phrasing. Your brother arranged for an empty coffin to be buried in your daughter's name, Your Grace. I cannot yet say with certainty why, though I have my suspicions, and I do not think you will find them comforting." Ambrose's suspicions had already arrived at the same place, weeks before he allowed himself to say it aloud. Archibald had positioned himself, quietly and patiently, as the natural heir to everything that was not the title itself for 19 years. The private fortune, the unentailed lands, the London properties, the trust Ambrose had built for a daughter he believed dead. A living heiress would have ended that patient arithmetic in a single afternoon. "He is my brother," Ambrose said, more to himself than to Sebastian. "He is also," Sebastian said, "the only man who discouraged you from searching further for Cecilia Holloway, and the only man who insisted your late wife's grief had unbalanced her mind, rather than sharpened it." Lucy, meanwhile, had begun to spend her mornings not in idle recovery, but in the estate's smaller library, teaching herself the shape of ledgers and land records, with the same fierce discipline she had once applied to reading beyond her station at St. Cecilia's. Sebastian found her there more often than either of them planned, and their arguments over methodology gave way, by slow and unremarked degrees, to something gentler. "You read faster than half the clerks I have employed," he told her one grey afternoon, watching her trace a column of figures with her finger. "I had a teacher once who believed a girl's mind was worth educating, whatever her prospects," Lucy said. "I did not waste the gift, Mr. Goodwin, even when I had nothing else left to me. I begin to think nothing has ever been wasted on you." It was, for Sebastian, as close as he had come yet to admitting what he had begun to feel, and Lucy heard it for exactly what it was, and did not push him further, because she had learned already that trust, for this particular man, needed to be earned in careful, patient increments. Lady Beatrice, ever watchful, insisted Lucy could not continue to move about the estate on foot alone, and so it was Sebastian who was given the thankless task of teaching her to ride. "You must trust the horse," he said, standing at her stirrup in the cold, clear morning, "and trust me enough not to pull away when I steady you." "Trust," Lucy said, "is expensive, Mr. Goodwin. I have very little currency left to spend on it." "Then I shall have to earn it," he said, and his hand at her waist, as he helped her find her balance, lingered a fraction longer than instructions strictly required, and neither of them commented on it, though both of them noticed. It was during that same week that Ambrose finally read his late wife's letters in full, alone, late into the night. and found in them not the ramblings of a grieving mind, but the precise, furious clarity of a mother who had never once doubted her own certainty. They would not let me see her face properly, Ambrose. They said it would distress me further. I have buried a mother's instinct beneath a physician's authority once already, and I will not do so again. Something is wrong, and I mean to prove it, whatever it costs me. He wept for the first time in 19 years, alone in his study, for a wife he had failed to believe, and a daughter he had failed to search for. And when Lucy passed his door and heard the sound, she did not enter, because some griefs, she understood instinctively, needed to be witnessed only by the person carrying them. Sebastian found one more thread before he was through. Among the Abbey's old household accounts sat a christening inventory, drawn up the week Lady Lucinda was born, listing every gift and garment prepared for her, including a strip of embroidered ribbon, ordered from a Bond Street draper, its pattern of small silver stars unlike anything the draper had stitched before or since. He carried the inventory to Lucy's chamber and laid it beside the faded, water-stained ribbon she had kept since leaving St. Cecilia's. The pattern, worn and yellowed as it was, matched exactly. The final thread came from an old housemaid, long retired to a cottage near Eldermoor, whom Sebastian tracked down through payroll records going back 2 decades. She remembered, with the vivid clarity old women often retained for small things, long after they had forgotten large ones, a birthmark beneath the infant Lady Lucinda's left ear, shaped faintly like a crescent moon. Sebastian did not need to ask Lucy to check. He had already seen it, the day he helped her with her hair, before a dinner Beatrice insisted she attend, though he had not understood, until the housemaid spoke, precisely what he had been looking at. The pieces, laid side by side, no longer resembled coincidence. They resembled proof. Cecilia Holloway lived, when Sebastian finally found her, in a small cottage near Eldermoor, 3 days' ride from the Abbey, in a room that smelled of camphor and approaching death. 19 years of hiding had worn her down to something thin and grey, and when Ambrose entered her cottage himself, having refused to send Sebastian alone for a truth this large, she looked at him with the particular relief of a woman who has waited 2 decades to finally set down a weight too heavy to carry any further. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I wondered, some nights, whether you would come before I died, or after." Ambrose sat beside her narrow bed, his hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles whitened. "Tell me the truth, Cecilia, all of it. I have spent 19 years believing a lie, and I find I can no longer bear even 1 more hour of it." "Your daughter did not die," Cecilia said, and the words seemed to cost her what little strength remained in her chest. "I carried her out of Ashcroft alive, the same night the physician signed her death. Your brother arranged it. He paid the physician and the undertaker, and he ordered me, not gently, Your Grace, not with careful language, but plainly, to make certain the child was never seen again." Ambrose's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Did she suffer?" "She cried the whole way to London," Cecilia said, and something like tenderness broke through the grey exhaustion of her face for the first time. "I could not quiet her, no matter what I tried, until I remembered the lullaby her mother used to sing over the cradle each evening. I sang it the whole road to St. Cecilia's, and it was the only thing that ever settled her." Ambrose closed his eyes, and thought of a matron who had, by Sebastian's account, hummed a strange, unfamiliar melody to the children in her care for 19 years, a melody Lucy had once caught herself humming, without knowing where she had learned it. "I could not kill an innocent child, Your Grace, whatever your brother demanded of me," Cecilia went on, her breath rattling now with the effort of confession. "I told him I had done as he asked. I never told him where. I have lived in fear of him finding me ever since, more than I have feared my own dying. Why did you never come forward? In 19 years, Cecilia, why did you let me grieve a living child as though she were dead?" "Because I was afraid, Your Grace, and because I did not know if you would believe a nursemaid's word over your own brother's, and because the longer I stayed silent, the more the silence itself became a kind of guilt I did not know how to undo." Her hand, thin and trembling, found his. "I am sorry. I saved her life, and I stole 19 years of yours in the same breath, and I do not know how a person is meant to carry both truths at once. Ambrose did not forgive her that night, not fully, because forgiveness of that size could not be granted in a single sitting. But he took her sworn confession, witnessed by the local magistrate he had brought with him, for precisely that purpose, and he rode back to Ashcroft Abbey with something in his chest he had not permitted himself to feel in 19 years. Hope, terrifying and unguarded. He found Lucy in the small parlor, mending a torn hem with the careful, practical stitches of a girl who had spent a lifetime making do. And he did not begin with ledgers or legal recognition, or the fortune that now, by every measure of proof, belonged to her. He began with the only truth she needed most. "You were wanted, Lucy," he said. "From the moment you were born, you were wanted, and you were never abandoned. You were stolen from me." He led her, then to the door at the end of the east corridor, and for the first time in 19 years, he turned the handle. The nursery had not changed. A cradle stood beneath the window facing the rose garden, draped now in dust rather than the soft linens Evelyn had once chosen with such care. A small portrait hung above the mantel, a young woman with grey-green eyes and dark hair, holding an infant Lucy did not remember, but somehow, standing in that doorway, recognized in the marrow of her bones. "That is your mother," Ambrose said. "Evelyn, she never stopped believing you were alive, and I let a physician's paper convince me she had lost her reason instead." Lucy stood very still in the doorway, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not carry the grateful softness Ambrose might have hoped for. "You believed a paper over your own wife's certainty." "I did," Ambrose said without excuse, because excuses would have insulted what she deserved. "I trusted my brother's counsel and a physician's signature over the woman who loved you most, and I have spent every day since burying that failure beneath duty, because it was easier than looking at it directly." Lucy's anger, when it came, was not loud. It was the quiet, exhausted anger of a girl who had spent a lifetime being told she was not wanted, only to learn the truth had been sitting locked behind a door the whole time. "Why did you not find me?" "Because I trusted the men who lied to me," Ambrose said, "and failed to trust the woman who loved you enough to keep searching, long after I had stopped." She asked him then, quietly, the question that had sat beneath every other question since she was old enough to wonder about her own beginnings. "Were you ever happy after I was gone?" "I was alive," Ambrose said. It was not the same thing. Something in the plain honesty of his answer reached her, where a grander apology would not have. She did not call him father that afternoon. Not yet, because trust of that size could not be granted all at once, any more than forgiveness could. But she let him take her hand, and she let herself weep in the nursery that had waited 19 years for her return. And by the time she finally climbed the stairs that evening, something between them had shifted, tentative and imperfect, into the shape of a family beginning to remember how to be one. Legal recognition, Ambrose's solicitors informed him, would require more than a mother's letters and a dying woman's confession. It would require sworn statements, verification of the foundling register, confirmation of the falsified death certificate, testimony from Cecilia while she yet lived, examination of the locket and the christening ribbon by men whose word a magistrate would trust, and weeks, possibly months, of patient documentation. Ambrose did not wait for the paper to catch up with what his heart had already accepted. He began, in the meantime, to teach his daughter the shape of the life she had been born to and denied. Lady Beatrice took her measure with a seamstress's eye, and pronounced her, within a fortnight, presentable for private company, though she muttered darkly about 19 years of lost training that could not be undone in a season. Lucy learned the correct forms of address, the correct way to enter a room, the correct way to appear unsurprised by wealth she had spent her whole life longing for and despising in equal measure. "A lady never shows astonishment in society," Beatrice informed her, adjusting the set of Lucy's shoulders before a private gathering. "Whatever absurdity presents itself to her, her face must remain a portrait of composure." "Even?" Lucy asked, straight-faced. when a woman across the room is wearing what appears to be an entire dead bird upon her head. Especially then, Beatrice said, without a flicker of humor, though Lucy caught the corner of her mouth twitching in a manner she suspected the older woman would never admit to. The gathering itself, a modest private ball held at a neighboring estate, meant to introduce Lucy gently to society before her full recognition became public, tested every lesson Beatrice had drilled into her. Lucy wore a gown of pale green silk that Beatrice had chosen for the way it caught the color of her eyes, and when Sebastian saw her descend the staircase, he did not compliment the dress at all. "You look less afraid tonight," he said. "Is that what you noticed first, Mr. Goodwin?" "Not the gown Lady Beatrice fretted over for a week. It is always what I notice first," he said, and something in the plain honesty of it made her pulse quicken in a manner four forks and correct curtsies had never managed to teach her to hide. They danced, once, with the careful formal distance propriety demanded, and Lucy felt the whole of the ballroom's chandeliers and silk and gossip fall away into background noise beneath the simple fact of his hand at her waist, and the quiet intensity with which he watched her, as though memorizing something he feared he might not be permitted to keep. A Marquis of considerable fortune and considerably less subtlety spent the better part of an hour attempting to secure her attention, and Sebastian's mood, Lucy noted with some private satisfaction, grew visibly colder with each passing minute. She found him afterward among the winter roses of the conservatory, arms folded, jaw set in the particular stillness she had learned meant he was working very hard to appear unaffected by something that had, in fact, affected him considerably. "You disapprove of the Marquis," she said. "I dislike the way he looks at you," Sebastian admitted, and then, as though the honesty had escaped before he could stop it, added, "I have disliked a great many things about tonight, Miss Shaw. You have looked at me with suspicion since the very night we met, Mr. Goodwin. Forgive me if I find your sudden protectiveness a curious development." "Suspicion was safer," he said quietly. They stood close enough, among the pale winter roses, that Lucy could feel the warmth of him, even through the cold conservatory air, close enough that she thought, for one unsteady breath, he might finally close the distance neither of them had yet named. He did not. He withdrew, with the particular discipline of a man reminding himself of every reason caution existed, and left her standing alone among the roses with her pulse still unsteady, and her patience, she privately admitted, wearing rather thin. It was a week later, returning from a visit to Cecilia's bedside where the old nurse's health had begun its final, gentle decline, that the storm caught them both on the road home, forcing Lucy and Sebastian to shelter in an abandoned hunting lodge on the edge of Ashcroft land, while rain hammered the shutters and thunder rattled what remained of the old glass. He gave her his coat without being asked. Her hair had come loose from its careful pins in the rain, falling dark and damp about her shoulders, and in the small, close space of the lodge, lit only by the single lantern Sebastian had thought to bring, the careful distance they had both maintained for weeks grew suddenly, dangerously thin. "You are shivering," he said. "I am cold, Mr. Goodwin, not dying. There is no need to look at me as though I require rescuing from every small discomfort. I have found," he said, low, "that I am rather poor at watching you suffer even the smallest discomfort, without wishing to do something about it." He reached up and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek, his thumb lingering a moment longer than the gesture required, and Lucy felt her breath catch entirely, felt the whole small room narrow down to the space between them and the low, steady thunder of the storm outside. He leaned in. She did not step away, not at first, until some old fear, some remnant of Dorian's false promises and every man who had used tenderness as a tool of theft, rose up in her chest and made her step back before either of them could finish what the moment had begun. "Forgive me," she said, unsteady. "I do not yet know if you believe me innocent, or merely find me convenient to want." Something in Sebastian's face flickered with hurt he did not bother to hide. "I have never once thought you convenient, Lucy." It was the first time he had used her given name without title, and neither of them commented on it, though the storm outside seemed for one long moment entirely beside the point. They rode back to the Abbey once the rain eased, in a silence that held more than words could have managed, and Lucy lay awake that night, turning over the ache of wanting something she was not yet brave enough to trust. It was in the days following that she found the courage to voice a hope she had been quietly building since her first month at St. Cecilia's. That whatever fortune the law eventually restored to her, some part of it ought to go toward a refuge for girls like the one she had been, hungry and unwanted, and convinced their worth had died along with their families. Ambrose listened to the plan with something like pride breaking through his usual composure. It shall be done, whatever the courts decide. You need not wait for legal recognition to begin building something worth building. Lucy smiled, for the first time in the whole long ordeal, without the shadow of old grief behind it. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile peace was about to be threatened. Archibald Sterling had spent 19 years arranging his life around a fortune he believed permanently his, and he was not a man inclined to surrender that arithmetic quietly. He had watched, from the careful distance of a brother who understood how to appear supportive while gathering knives, as Lucy's presence at Ashcroft Abbey moved from private curiosity to near certain fact. He understood, better than most, that he could not argue against her blood. The proof, gathered piece by piece over the preceding weeks, was becoming too solid to dispute honestly. So he did not attempt to dispute her birth at all. Instead, he set out to poison her intentions. He began by investigating Lucy's recent history with the patient thoroughness he had spent decades perfecting, and it was in that investigation that he uncovered the promissory notes she had signed under Dorian Vaughan's false courtship, the debt that had left her homeless in the first place. He found Dorian within a fortnight, still working small frauds against vulnerable women across London, and made him an offer no debt-ridden schemer would easily refuse. You will not need to claim she is unrelated to my brother, Archibald told him, over brandy in a private club far from Ashcroft eyes. The blood is proven well enough by now. You need only suggest she knew it before she ever entered that dining room, that she saw the crest, learned the story, and staged her hunger deliberately to win a duke's sympathy and a fortune's inheritance. Dorian, whose only loyalty had ever been to his own comfort, agreed readily enough, particularly once he understood the sum involved. The forged letters arrived at Ashcroft Abbey through careful channels a week later, correspondence purporting to be between Lucy and Dorian, discussing a plan to exploit the Duke's guilt and grief for material gain. The forgery was, Sebastian would later admit with grudging respect, remarkably well constructed. It used Lucy's genuine handwriting as a template, referenced real events from her past with disturbing accuracy, and included a witness statement from a servant, claiming to have seen her loitering near the hotel in the days before her supposed chance encounter with Ambrose. The lie was dangerous, precisely because it did not deny her blood. It attacked the one thing evidence alone could never fully disprove: her intention. Ambrose read the letters alone in his study, and though every instinct built over the preceding weeks told him they were false, some old wound, the same wound that had let him believe a physician's paper over his wife's certainty 19 years before, reopened beneath the weight of them. He found Lucy in the small parlor and asked her the one question that would haunt them both for weeks afterward. "Did you know who I was, Lucy, before you entered that dining room?" She heard, in the plainness of his question, every rejection she had ever endured, every charity home matron who had assumed the worst of a hungry girl, every employer who had dismissed her without cause, every stranger who had called her vermin in a warm dining room while she starved outside it. She did not plead her innocence. She did not weep, though the temptation to do so nearly undid her composure entirely. She reached up, unclasped the locket from her throat, and set it gently upon the desk between them. "I asked you for bread, Father," she said, her voice steady though her hands were not. "I never asked you for your fortune." She offered, then, to renounce every claim the courts might eventually grant her: Evelyn's marriage settlement, the private estates, the London properties, the trust built for a daughter Ambrose had believed dead, every jewel and title of inheritance beyond the simple fact of her birth. She would keep only the truth of her blood, and surrender everything else, rather than remain beneath a roof where her worth required constant proving. It was in the silence that followed, watching his daughter offer to walk away from a fortune, rather than defend herself against an accusation that could never fully be disproven, that Ambrose understood, with sudden and total clarity, what his brother had very nearly succeeded in stealing from him a second time. "No," he said. "You will not renounce anything, Lucy. I was a fool to ask the question at all, and I will not compound that failure by letting fear separate us twice in one lifetime." Sebastian, meanwhile, had grown distant in the weeks since the forged letters arrived. Not from doubt, though Lucy did not yet know that, but from the careful, silent work of tracing every thread of the forgery back to its source. Archibald had a servant planted within the Abbey's own walls, and Sebastian dared not risk revealing his suspicions until he had proof solid enough to survive a courtroom. Lucy, watching him retreat into cold silence at precisely the moment she needed him most, mistook his caution for judgment. "You were the first man who ever saw my mind before my name," she told him one evening, her voice tight with a hurt she did not bother to disguise. "I did not think you would become the next man to doubt both." The words wounded him more deeply than she could have known, though he could not yet tell her why he had grown so distant, and the silence between them grew, for a time, colder than the storm that had once nearly brought them together. It was Lucy herself, in the end, who found the thread that unraveled the entire conspiracy. Reading the forged letters again, late one night, searching for anything that might prove their falseness, she noticed a small habitual error, repeated twice: the word separate, spelled separate. Precisely the mistake Dorian Vaughan had made in every genuine letter he had once written her during his false courtship. She found, too, a phrase she recognized instantly, one he had used to persuade her to sign the promissory notes that had ruined her. A future worth wagering everything upon. It was Dorian's phrase, unmistakably, buried inside a letter, meant to prove her own guilt. She brought the discovery to Sebastian immediately, forgetting, in her excitement, the coldness that had grown between them, and watched something in his expression shift from guarded distance to open relief. "I have been tracing the same forgery for weeks," he admitted. "The paper came from a stationer Dorian frequents. The seal bears an incorrect heraldic detail. The ink itself was manufactured after the date the letter claims to have been written. I could not tell you what I had found, Lucy, because Archibald has a servant within these very walls, and I feared what he might do if he learned we were close to proof. You let me believe you doubted me. I let you believe a smaller pain," Sebastian said, "to protect you from a larger one. I do not know now if that was wisdom or cowardice, and I find I would rather you decide than continue guessing." Lucy studied him a long moment, weighing weeks of cold silence against the plain evidence of his devotion laid bare before her, and found, in the end, that she could not stay angry at a man who had spent every one of those silent nights working, in secret, to save her. "I intend to write to Dorian," she said instead. "I shall offer to renounce my claim entirely, if he returns the original promissory notes he forged against me. He will come, because he wants money, and because he wants to believe he still controls me. It is dangerous, Lucy. Everything about my life since the night I asked a stranger for bread has been dangerous, Mr. Goodwin. I find I have grown rather accustomed to it." Dorian, when the letter reached him, took the bait exactly as Lucy predicted, arranging to meet under the pretense of a private settlement, and it was that arrangement, laid carefully alongside every thread Sebastian had gathered in silence for weeks, that would finally bring the entire conspiracy crashing down upon the men who had built it. Ambrose sent word to his brother that the girl had been exposed as a calculating fraud, and that a private settlement was required before the scandal reached the newspapers. Archibald arrived at Ashcroft Abbey within 2 days, his relief so poorly concealed that Sebastian, watching from the gallery above the great drawing room, felt his last doubt about the man's guilt dissolve entirely. Dorian arrived separately, an hour later, believing himself present to collect payment for services quietly rendered, and finding instead a room considerably fuller than he had anticipated. Archibald settled into a chair near the fire, easy and confident, already certain the matter was concluded in his favor. "I confess, Ambrose, I always suspected the girl was too convenient a miracle to be genuine. A homeless creature begging for bread, wearing our mother's crest by pure chance. You were a fool to entertain it as long as you did." "Careful, Archibald," Ambrose said, his voice deceptively mild. "You speak of my daughter." "Your daughter is dead," Archibald said, the lie so familiar on his tongue by now that he had very nearly convinced himself of it. "Has been dead 19 years. This girl is a gutter-born opportunist who saw an old crest and built a fortune's worth of lies around it. And frankly, Ambrose, the family should have been rid of her the moment she appeared at that hotel door." It was at that precise moment that the doors of the great drawing room opened, and Lucy entered, flanked by Lady Beatrice, Sebastian, Cecilia Holloway, weak but upright, brought from her sickbed at her own insistence, the local magistrate, the Foundling Home's matron, and an elderly clerk who had once worked beneath the physician who signed a false death certificate 19 years before. Archibald's confidence drained from his face by careful, visible degrees, as each piece of evidence was laid before the room in turn. Cecilia's sworn confession, witnessed and notarized, describing the night she carried a living infant out of Ashcroft, rather than obey an order to make her disappear permanently. The Foundling Home's admission record, dated the same night as the false death, bearing the name Cecilia Holloway, in the matron's own careful hand. The undertaker's ledger, showing payment for a sealed coffin, and Archibald's private surcharge, with no receipt anywhere for the delivery of a body. Evelyn's letters, read aloud by Ambrose himself, proving a mother's certainty that had been dismissed as madness rather than believed as truth. The physician's irregular certificate, its signature, confirmed forged by the elderly clerk who had watched the real physician's hand for 30 years and knew it was not his own. Then came the forged letters themselves, laid bare one by one. The stationer's receipt proving where the false correspondence had been purchased, the incorrect heraldic detail in the seal, the ink manufactured months after the letters claimed to be written, the payment trail leading from Archibald's own steward to a false witness willing to swear to a fabricated sighting, and finally, Lucy's own bait letter and Dorian's eager reply, proving beyond any remaining doubt that the entire conspiracy had been constructed, deliberately and knowingly, to steal a stolen daughter twice over. Dorian, watching the noose tighten around a scheme he had believed himself clever enough to survive, turned on his co-conspirator with the swift, practiced self-preservation of someone who had never once been loyal to anyone but himself. "He came to me," Dorian said, pointing at Archibald with a hand that shook badly enough to betray his fear. "He found my old debts to the girl and offered to pay them twice over if I would forge the letters. I never claimed she was unrelated to your family, Your Grace. I only ever claimed what he told me to claim." "You are both liars," Archibald snapped, "and neither of your words carries weight against a duke's brother." "They carry precisely the weight the magistrate assigns them," Ambrose said quietly, "and I believe he has heard quite enough already." Archibald's composure broke entirely then, and in the desperate arithmetic of a man watching 19 years of careful theft collapse in a single afternoon, he lunged not for the door, but for Lucy herself, seizing her wrist with a grip meant to drag her toward the garden doors and whatever chaos might follow. Sebastian moved before anyone else in the room had fully registered what was happening, catching Archibald's arm and wrenching him back with a disciplined speed he had once needed in earnest and never entirely forgotten. The two constables Ambrose had stationed discreetly near the garden entrance were inside the room within seconds, and Archibald found himself restrained before he had taken 3 steps toward the door. Ambrose stood over his brother, with a stillness more frightening than any shout could have managed. "You stole 19 years from my child," he said. "You will not take another moment of her life from her." Dorian was arrested alongside him, his desperate attempts to shift the blame doing little to save him from the consequences of his own greed, and by nightfall, Both men had been removed from Ashcroft Abbey in disgrace, leaving behind a house that felt, for the first time in 19 years, entirely free of the shadow that had haunted it. Archibald, in the final ugliness of his defeat, turned back once more, before the constables led him away, his voice dripping with the contempt he had never fully hidden. "A gutter girl," he spat at Lucy, "playing at nobility. No title will ever erase what you were." Lucy faced him without flinching, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. "What I was taught me hunger and mercy, and how to endure what should have broken me. What you were given taught you only greed, though you were handed every advantage a man could ask for. I know which inheritance I would rather carry, uncle. I do not envy yours in the slightest." The room, when Archibald and Dorian were finally led away, fell into a silence that held, for the first time in the whole long ordeal, something like peace rather than grief. It was that evening, in the quiet of the Abbey library, where their strange friendship had first begun, that Sebastian finally said the words he had spent weeks refusing himself the right to speak. "I began this by searching for proof that you were false," he told her, the fire casting warm light across a face that had finally set down its careful guard. "I found instead that every false thing in this house had been arranged against you, and that the one true thing left standing was the woman I had been so determined not to trust. You avoided me for weeks, Mr. Goodwin. I believed you had judged me unworthy. I avoided you," he said, "because loving you while the whole of society debated your worth felt like its own kind of theft, as though I would be taking something from you before you had the chance to claim it fully for yourself. I did not want you to choose me out of gratitude or fear, or because I was the only steady thing in a house full of uncertainty. I wanted you to choose me once you were entirely free to choose anything at all. And now, Sebastian said, closing the last careful distance between them. You are free, Lucy. Your name is your own. Your fortune, whatever remains of it after your school is built, is your own. And I find I can no longer bear one more evening pretending I do not love you entirely." He kissed her then, gently at first and then with the accumulated ache of every restrained evening that had come before it. And Lucy, who had spent a lifetime believing herself unworthy of being chosen freely, finally let herself believe it was true. "I loved you," he murmured against her hair, "before the law ever restored your name. I loved the woman who once divided half a loaf of bread in her mind, before she ever tasted a bite of it, certain someone beyond that dining room was hungrier than she was. You forgot my poor table manners," Lucy said, laughing despite the tears standing in her eyes. "I intend to endure them for the rest of my life," Sebastian said, and meant it entirely. In the weeks that followed, the courts confirmed what every scrap of evidence had already proven beyond doubt. Lady Lucinda Sterling was formally restored to her name, her birth, and her inheritance. Not the dukedom itself, which would pass in time through the male line to a distant cousin, but Evelyn's marriage settlement, the unentailed lands, the London properties, the revenues of Silver Oak Hall and its farms, the family jewels, and the trust Ambrose had built for a daughter he had once believed lost forever. Lucy chose to remain Lucy among those she loved, whatever the law now called her, and used a portion of her restored fortune to open a school and refuge for homeless and abandoned girls not far from St. Cecilia's, staffed by teachers who believed, as her own compassionate teacher once had, that a girl's mind was worth educating, whatever her prospects appeared to be. Ambrose asked her once, quietly, whether she intended to remain at Ashcroft. "Not because the law says I belong here," Lucy told him. "Because you asked me to stay, and because I have finally learned to believe I am wanted for my own sake, rather than my usefulness." Sebastian proposed to her that autumn, not at a grand ball or a public ceremony, but quietly, in the Abbey library where their long, careful courtship had first begun. "I do not ask for Lady Lucinda's fortune," he told her, kneeling by the same low table where they had once sat reading Evelyn's letters together by firelight. "I ask for Lucy's honesty, her temper, her courage, and her impossible habit of arguing with me over every small point of etiquette Beatrice tries to teach her." "You forgot my poor table manners," Lucy said again, smiling through happy tears. I intend to endure those as well, Sebastian said, for the rest of my life, if you will have me. She said yes before he had even finished rising from his knee, and the wedding took place at Ashcroft Abbey that November, in the great drawing room where a conspiracy had once been unraveled, and a family had learned, at terrible cost, how to trust one another fully. Ambrose walked his daughter down the aisle himself, his composure breaking only once, when Lucy paused beside him and said, quietly enough that only he could hear it, "Thank you for finding me, Father." "Thank you," he answered, "for forgiving a man who took 19 years to earn the right to call you that." By the following spring, Lucy carried the certain, unmistakable signs of a child of her own, and the household that had spent so long shadowed by grief, filled instead with the particular anxious joy of a family awaiting new life. Ambrose fussed over her in ways that made Beatrice laugh outright, insisting on physicians who had not been consulted, blankets that had not been requested, a nursery repainted, though the old one, restored now to warmth and sunlight, needed no improvement at all. "You would think," Beatrice told her brother, watching him hover over Lucy's chair at dinner, with a solicitude he had never once shown his own household staff, that no woman in the history of England had ever before carried a child. "This one," Ambrose said simply. "I intend not to fail a second time." Through the summer months, as Lucy's condition advanced and her fortune's refuge welcomed its first dozen girls, she found herself, more often than not, seated by the nursery window watching the rose garden bloom, her hand resting over the quiet, growing weight of the child within her, and thinking of the woman in the portrait above the mantel, who had never stopped believing her daughter was alive. "I hope," she told Sebastian one evening, his hand resting gently over hers, "that she knows, somehow, that her granddaughter will grow up wanted from the very first breath." "I believe," Sebastian said, "she has known it all along." The child came in early August, 9 months almost to the day after the wedding, in the same season the roses Evelyn had once planted beneath the nursery window came into their fullest bloom. It was a difficult labor, long enough that Ambrose paced the hall outside with a fear he had not felt since the night, 20 years before, he had been told his first child had died. But when the cry finally came, thin and furious and unmistakably alive, it was Beatrice who emerged first to tell him the news, her stern composure entirely undone by happy tears. "A daughter, Ambrose," she said, "healthy, and loud enough to wake the whole of Kent. They named her Evelyn, for the grandmother she would never meet, but whose stubborn, unshakable certainty had ultimately saved her mother's life 2 decades before her own birth." Lucy held her daughter for the first time in the same nursery where she herself had once stood, weeping, before a portrait of a mother she had never known and understood, with a completeness that finally settled every restless doubt she had carried since the night she begged a stranger for bread, that her worth had never once depended on the name she carried, or the fortune eventually restored to her. It had been there all along, patient and unshaken, waiting only for someone brave enough to see it. That winter, as snow gathered once more over Ashcroft Abbey, warm loaves of bread were sent each morning, from the Abbey's own kitchens, to the refuge Lucy had built for girls who understood hunger the way she once had, not thrown away as waste, not offered as grudging charity, but given freely, while still warm, to hands that had once known what it meant to be turned away from a door. Lucy stood at the nursery window one such morning, her daughter asleep against her shoulder, Sebastian's hand resting warm at the small of her back, and watched the bread leave the kitchens below, and thought that if anyone had told her, standing shivering in that service alley a year before, that hunger would one day lead her to a father, a husband, a daughter, and a house full of warmth she had once believed reserved for other, luckier people, she would not have believed a word of it. She was glad, now, that life had not asked her permission before proving her wrong. If Lucy's story moved you tonight, if you found yourself hoping, right alongside her, that she would finally be seen for who she truly was, we would be so grateful if you left a comment telling us which moment struck you hardest. Was it the bread, the nursery door, the moment Sebastian finally chose her freely? We read every word you write, and stories like this one exist, because listeners like you keep asking for them. If you have not yet subscribed, please consider joining us, so you never miss the next tale of stolen heirs, proud houses, and love that had to be earned before it could be spoken. Like this video if it kept you here until the very end, and share it with someone who still believes, as Lucy did, that worth is never something the world gets to decide for us. Thank you, truly, for spending these hours with Lucy, with Ambrose, and with Sebastian, for sitting with us through the hunger, the suspicion, the slow unraveling of 19 years of lies, and the quiet, hard-won joy that waited at the end of it. Stories like this one remind us that dignity is never measured by what a person owns, and that the people who see our worth before the world confirms it are the ones truly worth keeping close. We have more stories like this one waiting for you. More dukes, more stolen names, more quiet girls who turn out to carry more strength than the houses that once turned them away. Until then, take care of yourselves, be gentle with the people around you, and we will see you at the next fireside. Good night, dear listeners, and thank you, always, for staying until the very last word.